intimate group. And hopefully what this does is give you permission to ask any questions you'd like. We have an old timer here with Erin, and maybe the two of you, Amber and Jamie, could you tell us where you're from and what you do?
Sure. I'll start. Hi, everyone. Jamie Angelini. I'm with the Mental Health Association in New Jersey, where I've been the last 22 years as a mental health advocate and mental health trainer. So good to see everyone.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
And Amber.
Hey, my name's Amber. I am Erin's coworker, actually, and I also work at Ginny's house, and I'm one of the clinicians there as well.
Well, thank you for joining. And again, the small number does not deter us. We do this in the exact same way we would do if we had a room full of 500 people. So I want to welcome you. Obviously, I'm Maureen Underwood, and I want to just kind of go over, these are what the goals have been for our collaborative meetings. And what I wanted to reinforce today was the fact that what we do is we highlight relevant and topical issues, because there, I looked at the topic for today, which is, trauma with kids and grief. And I thought, there's no way we could do this any kind of justice in such a short amount of time. So I just want to reinforce the highlight. And even though it talks about here suicide assessment, management, and prevention, it's also about people who are at risk for suicide, kids who are at risk for suicide. And certainly the populations that you deal with meet that criteria. And again, this was my attempt to kind of pull it in to talk about that this is just a slice of the pie. And what I want to say to you all is, if there's something that we talk about today you would like to emphasize more in future trainings, just let us know and we will do that. Today we're going to talk more about grief related to the loss of a family member. There are other traumatic loss events and deaths that kids experience, but most of the time, if they get referred to treatment, it's because it's been the loss of a caregiver. It may be the loss of a peer, and we could talk about that in another meeting if that's something that you're interested in. So our agenda for today looks like a lot, but we go through it relatively quickly. As you all know, from our other trainings, we always start out with some self-assessment questions. So we're just going to refer these to you. You certainly can have copies of this PowerPoint, so you can take a look at them at some point in time. We're going to talk about the key points of grief from a developmental perspective. Obviously, everything we do with kids relates to how old they are or where they are developmentally, age sometimes being pretty relative. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to briefly look at trauma-informed therapy and trauma in the context of how trauma complicates grief, because it does make it more challenging, as you all know. I use that word highlight the impact of traumatic loss very intentionally, because this is just a very brief overview. And we're going to talk about basic therapeutic approaches, not treatment per se, but these are the things that you want to be mindful of, whatever kind of treatment modality you choose to use. So these are generalizable things, no matter what you're doing to approach trauma in kids. The questions to ask yourself, again, these are pretty typical. And the first one, I just want to say, what training have you done in trauma-informed care? To me, this reflects the fallacy of graduate school, that once we have a degree, we can deal with anything. You get out of graduate school, you can handle anything in the world. And I have to tell you, as one of those people who writes the questions for the LCSW exam, they expect that. They expect that you know something about everything. I don't know where you learn all this, but that's probably why that test is so hard, because how could you know things about everything? So This is really kind of saying, I think that that's a fallacy. And the good news about this is there really are a gazillion resources out there on trauma that are available today. So there's a lot of ways to increase your knowledge and skill. As you know, I'm going to give you a couple of resources at the end of the program that I think are really good and have been helpful to me. The other thing I want to point out on this is, what your approach is. You probably do a lot of things intuitively that are based on your clinical judgment or your clinical instinct, and you don't realize that there's a theoretical context behind them. And especially with kids, I think when you can think about that context and especially expand it to systems theory. As you know, you just can't work with kids without thinking about the context of the system they're involved in, whether it's a foster care system, whether it's the school system, whether it's a religious system. So I think it's important, that you're going to consider those sorts of things. And finally, that pacing. I know pacing is important in every single therapeutic setting, but I think with trauma, my experience is it's even more important. So we're going to talk about that as we go through. And as I said, we're going to briefly start by looking at grief developmentally. And this is, as we see, we're going to see this is a real highlight of what could be probably an all-day training. So I want to give you a look developmentally at some of the typical expressions of grief we see in children. You know this if you work with kids, so this is just, again, basically a review for you. And you know that those 3 and 4-year-olds, oftentimes what you're going to be seeing there is regressive behavior. And I think the important thing that you look at in a therapeutic environment is how long the regression continues. And sometimes it's really related to the circumstance of the death. I can remember Marnie and I worked with families who's had lost a parent it's September 11th. And a lot of those kids were very, very young. And the regressiveness of those little ones was pretty profound, and it did last for a while. I will tell you, I think that as with all of these, and that's why I say that systems approach is critical, the remaining parent also had a very difficult time with letting go. So I think it was, trying to parse out what were the kids' reactions versus how the remaining parent who truly needed that kid to be close was complicating that. And the thing I think that I also found most important related to suicide on this one is they repetitively often ask the same question related to circumstances of the death. In the years that I worked with families who had children and someone who had died by suicide, usually it was a parent, but sometimes it was a sibling. Often, especially with younger children, there's a reluctance to tell the children what happened, that it was a suicide, and not necessarily just with younger kids. I remember a mom whose older daughter was like 12, and the father had killed himself in his car, and the story given to the kids was he was in a car accident, not that he had shot himself. And ultimately kids find out, and when they find out, the impact on the trust of every single person who has told them the wrong story is profound. It is so profound. And I've seen it so many times. So I call this to your attention because lots and lots of people think they're protecting their younger child because the circumstances are so difficult, but they really make it worse. And that goes through across the span of development here. The 5 and 6-year-olds, I think oftentimes what we see with 5 and 6-year-olds, it's hard to understand that the person is not going to be coming back because sometimes it's the euphemisms people use to explain the death. Sometimes it's they see these videos that get put together as reminders of the life of the deceased. And it's like, well, there's my dad. He's still there. He's still playing with us. So I think that that's some of the things that can be complicated. And what you see as the last thing on here, that concern about the surviving parent, which also can sort of move into what we see on the next slide for the 7 to 9-year-olds. Oftentimes what we want to do and what families want to do when a child says, well, what if something happens to you? We want to reassure them that it's okay. This was an accident. This isn't going to happen to me, rather than addressing the feeling. And this is where that validation comes in. I can see you're worried that because your dad died, I might die too. And let's talk about that for a second. If something were to happen to me, who in the family do you think would be there to take care of you? Do you think it would be your Aunt Pat? Yeah, so if something happens to me, this is who is going to be there to take care of you, because that's what that question is really about. It's me. You're still looking at kids who are pretty egocentric. And that's the question that they want to know is what's going to happen to me. For those 10 to 11-year-olds, when you see that desire to keep their feelings private, I think that this is why I personally feel that groups are so much more effective for these kids than individual sessions. They do ask much more mature feelings about death. And one of the things that we've seen, just to go back for a second to that group theme, is in most of the groups that we've done with kids who've had losses, they're in a variety of stages. So a child who has a recent loss may be sitting across from a kid who had a loss a year ago. And what that lets them see is that, oh, you're the same as you were. Life still goes on, because this kid will talk about, these were some of the challenges I had, but here's how I've gone on. So there's a modeling for them about the trajectory of grief in childhood that can be very, very helpful. And again, we know with these kids that other deaths may reactivate this current loss. So it's important. I don't know if we've ever talked about the grief closet, but we may talk about that in the questions, because that's one of the ways to help kids understand, we don't necessarily grieve losses when they happen. We store them. For the 13 and up year old, even though they understand death in a much more adult way, they often need to reprocess losses that have happened earlier in their life at that appropriate developmental level. So a child who lost someone at 7 is going to need to reprocess probably at 12, 13, and again at 18, and maybe at 30, because it relates to where they are in their life and what the loss means at that particular point in time. So my loss of a dad at 7 is different than my loss of a dad when I'm 18. There were different things he would have given me or done for me. So that's some of what is really important. And the other thing I think that's important with this is that kids can have guilt at not being sad all the time. Everyone in their family is just feels terrible, and they're having fun with their friends sometimes, and they can feel very guilty. And so it's really important to, address the fact that this kind of it's okay. Just because you're not sad all the time doesn't mean you're dishonoring the person who died. For those of you who work with kids in inner city environments, kids who are used to a lot of loss, particularly if the losses that they're dealing with often are suicide and homicide, those kids often have a limited life expectancy. They've seen so many people who are their age or kids in their school die by the time they're 18, that may be where they see their life going. So it's important to ask questions about that. I wonder, since, you seem to know a lot of kids who've passed away, what do you think about how long you're going to be here? Do you ever wonder that you might die young too? And it opens the door to a wonderful, wonderful conversation that no one else is going to have with these kids. So given that's the developmental sequencing, I want to put trauma into the conversation here. And this is the definition that we're using. The reason that the death of a parent can be emotionally harmful, as we just noticed, is that can make a child think of their own safety and security. Who is going to take care of me now? And it does, kind of line up on those adverse childhood experience scores. And what we know about kids in those ACE scores is oftentimes they manage to skate through their childhood and not have significant impacts. But particularly when it relates to death, and particularly when it's about suicide, we often see that in their young adulthood, suicide as a coping strategy starts to emerge more and more from a death that occurred when they were young. So I think it's important to look at that. And even if a kid says there wasn't any traumatic impact, I manage this, they've been referred to you. So there's a reason to suspect that something may be going on related to this. And, I've often had kids who come in and say, I'm fine. It hasn't changed my life at all. I didn't like my father anyway. And over the course of time, it's important to kind of talk about not just what you liked about your dad, but what you didn't like. And so giving kids permission to articulate that is so critically important. And sometimes that's where the trauma emerges. So in terms of trauma-informed therapy, I'm not going to spend much time on this because I know that if you're working with kids who are trauma, you know this. But what I want to talk to you about very quickly is a little bit about the ways in which you may not have thought about using these principles in your therapeutic encounters. For example, with safety, one of the ways I learned from kids was how I scheduled appointments. It was really trying to make sure that there was not someone coming prior to the child's appointment or going to come right after the child's appointment that they were going to run into in the waiting room. And if I thought that that might happen in my group practice, I made sure that I looked at the schedule and I gave them a 10 extra minute time to start. So I didn't start on the hour. I started 10 minutes after the hours, like train schedules, but I did that to make sure they weren't going to run into somebody in the waiting room, because most people operate on those half-hour schedules. That transparency and trustworthiness is informed consent. And there are times, even though you may say it at the beginning of your engagement with a child, you may have to remind them, as I told you in the beginning, there's certain things, if we talk about them, I'm going to have to let your family or your guardian know about that. Just want to remind you about that. But we're going to review that before we do it. And I'm going to help you with that. So it's not going to be something you're going to have to do alone. The thing about peer support, which I found be extraordinarily helpful, was letting kids bring in a friend sometimes, or bring in a sibling if they needed to. And what I would do in those particular situations, especially when it was a friend, sometimes it was a boyfriend or a girlfriend, because they were the ones who knew this kid the best. I would ask that friend to tell me about the client. Tell me some things about the client that maybe I don't know. What are some of the things they like to do? What is it that you like about them? Is there a silly story you can tell me? So I started out looking at them as someone prior to the impact of this traumatic death, moved down to talk about it, and then talk about perhaps how this person can be an important support to them after. So it's, again, that sort of bell-shaped curve of when I get into the difficult material, it's in the center. I don't have a child come in and right away say with a friend and say, oh, how do you think your friend is doing since his dad died? I just wouldn't go there. So it's a way to give an ego boost to a kid, to hear some of the things their friend thinks are cool about them. With siblings, I often ask general questions about the family as opposed to the client per se, because I don't want to have the kid feel targeted. Let's see. And the other thing in terms of empowerment, I always want to know what's happening in the family, because one of the things, especially when there's been a death by suicide and it's a child, what happens is the caregivers often become overprotective of the remaining child or children, and it makes them crazy. And so I really want to talk about that, help them understand a little bit where parents are coming through. And this may be where I set up a session with the child and the parents to come up with a support plan for both the parents and the kid. What is going to help the parents feel comfortable, and what does the child need? So it may not be checking on this child every hour, it's checking on this child every 3 hours to make sure they're safe, or whatever it is that's raising that issue. But that overprotection related to a death by suicide is pretty common. And again, when we look at why traumatic loss complicates grief, what I want to say about this is that, I gotta tell you, I think a traumatic loss is any loss that happens in the life of a child. Confronting death as a child is a really tough thing. So I think that, yes, it's especially hard when the circumstances are sudden and unexpected, but that assumptive world is violated whenever there's a death. And by the assumptive world, we mean, that life is fair, that, if you're good, good things happen, bad things only happen to bad people, and that everybody's kind. Those are sort of the three basic principles of the assumptive world we learned as children. And when we have a traumatic loss, often those get totally put out of whack, and it's real. The fact that good people have bad things happen to them is a fact in life. The fact that life is not fair is real. And it's very hard for us as caregivers of children to not want to try to make those things better when the issue is we have to help them live with them. On here, it talks about taking care of unfinished business or saying goodbye. I'm not sure anyone ever takes care of unfinished business. There's always dribs and drabs of it that are left, no matter how much time you have left to say goodbye. So I think it's a myth to say that. And sometimes it's helpful to say, you know what, no matter how much time you would have had, there's still going to be things that crop up, and that's okay. It's making it okay. I never thought about the fact that secondary losses can really be unanticipated. And I'm thinking of a young boy whose father died by suicide, and he was making his first communion. And what everybody was expected to do was have the parent of the same sex go to the altar with him when they made the first communion. And not only because his father was dead, but he knew it was a suicide. He was absolutely beside himself and didn't want to make his first communion. So we had to spend time talking about how difficult it was. It brought the suicide back up again, and who could be the stand-in. And he decided he wanted his older brother. His grandfather offered, but he decided he would be most comfortable with his older brother, who was willing to do that. In terms of those PTSD things, you may have kids who have nightmares, but one of the things that I noticed in particular was avoidance of circumstances or situations that reminded them of the loss. I was working with a family who were going to the gym for a swim meet, and the dad was coming on his own. The daughter was on the swim team, and he had a heart attack in the lobby and died. And so, this was a kid who really was training for the Olympics, and it was a real challenge for her to get back in any pool again, because it always reminded her of that. So I'm just saying, there are things, these are horrible, really kind of horrible things, but if you address them and you can sit with that and you can talk about how challenging that is, you really can help kids work through some of this. The next slide, I just put in for your review. If you work with kids, you're going to know all this stuff already, but I just wanted to put it in because it logically made sense. So I want to move to the next slide, which really is talking to you about the therapy goals. What youth need assistance with is what you're going to cover in therapy. So that reestablishment of safety and security, how you deal with that is really by asking that questions, if the worst happens, who do you think is going to take care of you? It's putting it out there. It's in the back of their heads. So it's putting that out there, letting them know they're safe and secure despite the fact that this person died. That trusting relationship can really be with someone else in the family, but it also can be with you temporarily. And then it's gradually translating that into someone else who is in their life in a consistent way. The kind of symbolic losses, again, that's some of that age-related thing and helping them anticipate this is going to come up. This is where usually families come together and, or it's the graduation of a sibling and what's that going to be like for them. Probably the thing I want to talk about just even a little bit more in depth, not a lot, because I know we don't have a lot of time, and I know Marnie always watches the clock because I talk a lot. is that hope for recovery. And that's letting kids come up for air. And I think it's important for adults as well as kids. And as I was thinking about this, I wanted to share a story again that came from my own experience. It was so profound for me. I remember it all these years later. You know, I would often see kids who had lost a parent. The other parent was, you know, working full time or whatever, and was challenged to be able to get the kids to a therapy session. So I would make a home visit, or I would pick them up and we would go for coffee, or we would go for ice cream, or so, you know, I picked them in the afternoon and we would have an activity out of the office. And I had this one teenage girl whose mother had recently killed herself. And her father, you know, was working overtime to try to manage things. So I would pick her up and we'd go for ice cream, we'd go for whatever. And there were a couple of times when, rather than, you know, going for something nurturing like that, she lived near a place where there were growing flowers, farms where they had flowers. And so I would say, do you want to go pick some flowers today? Oh, that sounds a good idea. So there were several times when we went and we picked flowers for an hour, you know, and we talked as each of us were kind of choosing which flowers we wanted. Remember, they were mostly, it was early in the fall and they were zinnias. And I didn't really think much of it. You know, this is what we're doing, this is how we're talking. I ran into her years later when she was grown. And she said to me, she said, you know, I have to thank you. I don't know if you understand how much it meant to me, those times when we went and we picked the flowers. She said it was such an unusual thing to do. I'd never done that before. And it just reminded me in the midst of all my despair that there was hope for things to be good and pretty in life again. And I want to thank you for that. Did I have any clue? Absolutely not. So it helped her see that there was hope for recovery in the real world. So it's using your imagination to really try to, and your judgment, obviously, but to try to put kids in a place where you don't have to tell them that life goes on. They can experience life going on. So what I want to say now is, you know, and this is very simple, something about designing your therapeutic approach. This goes back to you, which is where we started. And this, you have to remember, sometimes as caretakers of kids and caregivers to kids, you know, we just think, oh, if we care about them and we try to protect them, it's going to help them. And this is where the principles of resilience are so profound. When it really is about helping them embrace the ups and downs of life. You're not going to avoid. And so the imperatives that you have when you're doing therapy, when you're dealing with kids, as I said, these are the general principles, despite whatever style you're using. You'll see this on the next page. We've talked about ensuring safety. And what I want to say to you, you know, I've talked to you about safety in the therapeutic climate. You want to ask kids what happens to make them feel unsafe in the rest of their world. What would make them feel safe at home? What would make them feel safe at school? What would make them feel safe with themselves? Because these kids are at elevated risk for suicidal thoughts. And you're asking them, what do you do when your feelings scare you? That's how I ask about safety. Because even little kids get scared sometimes by their feelings. So you're really working on that therapeutic imperative of safety. And again, one of the things we've talked about a little bit before is how kids use play as a way to work through things. And one of the techniques that's really important for you to use with kids who've been involved in traumatic situations is competitive play. And competitive play are things like there's a winner and a loser, like checkers can be competitive play. And this is not where you're going to let kids win all the time. You play these as real games because it's important for kids to learn how to react when they lose or they fail and they're disappointed. And, you know, sometimes that happens and it mimics kind of the loss of control they have in that trauma, and it helps them tolerate disappointment. So that's an important thing to do. And it's teaching children that sometimes we all trip up in the sidewalks of life. We all trip. And what do we do when we get up? And letting kids move at their own speed knows that everyone doesn't do this at the same time and place, and that you have to believe that there is a transformational process in healing, but it's a process. And I think I personally have found this harder when it's someone who's lost every member of their family, maybe in a car accident or a fire, murders or suicide clusters. I have just found that it takes much longer to kind of work through this. What to tell kids who've experienced a therapeutic loss event. I've just given this to you so you can take a look at it. These are some of your defaults that you can turn to. The one that I want to call to your attention, because again, these are things that I've learned from kids and they really were so profound, is that last one, that your heart will hold on to what it needs. I was working in a group with teenagers when there was a 13-year-old boy in the group. And I'm always impressed when, and then this is my sexism, when boys come up with these profound statements about feelings. And this little kid talked about the fact that the day his father died was the same day that his best friend's birthday. When he said to us in the group, he said, isn't life just kind of amazing? He said, if you took that day off the calendar, wouldn't have been the day my father died, but I wouldn't have a best friend. And amazing how good and bad things can happen on the very same day. A 13-year-old boy. So when you talk about the heart holding on to things, this was one of his takeaways that I'm sure will be with him for the rest of his life, is that life is funny. Sometimes good and bad things happen at the very same time. So that's the end of what I have to say to you. It isn't, I guess. We're going to talk about metaphor. I somehow skipped that slide. And again, the activities that we have used really, and I particularly think they work with traumatic life events or metaphors. This is an example. This was a kid who's making a flower painting out of a real flower. And the message is, how do we, use memories to hold on to things that don't last? That's the metaphor. So it's a safe approach to talking about topics that could be threatening. For kids who need to contain and have emotional distance, they can do that. It's speaking to the unconscious. And again, letting kids decide on what the meaning is for them. Just like that little boy, that 13-year-old boy came up with his own meaning of, the fact that his father died and his best friend was born on the very same day of the year. He came up with his own meaning. We didn't come up with it for him. So I think, again, there's some control kids can have in deciding what the meaning is in their life. And if you'd like, we could do a whole session on metaphor, because, Marnie and I have used that for years, so successfully with kids who've been in really, really terrible places, adults as well. So I think we move on to the questions that we came up, unless you have other questions. This is what we sort of thought about, what your biggest challenge is in relation to helping clients of all ages deal with traumatic events. And what have you learned about yourself through your work with clients who've experienced trauma? You may have other questions. We open the floor